Hello and welcome to Total Dino, the podcast that asks, what's your favorite dinosaur? So, a few episodes ago, I decided to do Theropods as just a huge group to take up a whole episode. And today, I thought it was a good time to kind of continue that trend. And so you might hear in the background of this recording, I'm not sure if you can hear, if you take a listen, I've got some theropods chirping behind me. It's the first few days of spring, and I've got a new bird feeder right outside, so I decided to set up by my window and let the theropods chirp while I record. So, not sure how well you'll hear them on here, but they're out there. So, obviously, I'm talking about birds, because birds are theropods. So if you hear that, it's not fake. It's really being recorded outside my window, and it is deliberate. Anyway, let's start off with, the business side of things, which is basically, this is the part where I say like and subscribe, listen on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're hearing this, comment, all that stuff. And special thanks to all my patrons on Patreon. I really do appreciate the support. It helps me to keep my website up and keep me doing this. Thank you for all of that, and thank you for listening, and thank you, everyone. This has been a lot of fun. I do not plan on slowing down. So that takes us to the news. And since this is the Theropod episode, I do have one item about one very famous theropod. You've probably already heard about this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Spinosaurus has had a new species discovered. That is right. The famous, highly debated, highly controversial Spinosaurus. Let me just explain one quick thing. Spinosaurus is the name of a genus. That is not the most specific a classification can get. It goes one step more specific, and that is species. Yes, you see, those words are related. Specific means closer to the species level. Generic means more closer to the genus level. A little language lesson for you there. So, Spinosaurus genus, the more well-known, famous one is Spinosaurus aegypticus. A month or so ago now, another species was discovered, called Spinosaurus mirabilis. The more well-known and type species of Spinosaurus is Spinosaurus aegypticus. It is named that because it was originally discovered in Egypt. Sadly, those remains were bombed during World War II. Another example was found in Morocco, which is also northern Africa. So Spinosaurus mirabilis was found in Niger, which is the same general area of the continent that is northern Africa. It's a little farther south than Egypt and Morocco, but it's same continent, so it makes sense. And around the same time, about 95 million years ago. The notable differences between Spinosaurus mirabilis and aegypticus are that mirabilis is a little smaller, it's a little more gracile than Spinosaurus aegypticus, and probably the most notable thing is that it's got a little crest on its head. It's not a huge Parasaurolophus crest. It's more like a smaller, more like a Saurolophus crest. To be honest, that's what it looks like to me. Besides that, it pretty much looks the same. You've probably seen a lot of paleo art on it. It's been a really big deal lately. But that's, it's really interesting and cool. It says a lot about Spinosaurids in general. That's about as much as I'm going to go into it here. You'll find all kinds of stuff on YouTube and on the internet. People have been talking about it. So if you're a dinosaur person, you probably already know about it. But pretty cool. New Spinosaurus species. So now let's get into the main topic, which, as I mentioned, is theropods. First, I'm just going to explain quickly what a theropod is. They are Saurischian dinosaurs, which means they are not ornithischian, so they're more closely related to sauropods, but they are, of course, their own family. They can basically be defined as the meat-eating dinosaurs. So dinosaurs evolved from a carnivorous bipedal ancestor, a small reptile, and while the sauropods and most ornithischians evolved to kind of get heavier and become quadrupedal, theropods stayed bipedal, and for the most part, stayed carnivorous. So this is a pretty big generalization. There are some herbivorous theropods, which we'll get to, and there are bipedal ornithischians like pachycephalosaurs, but basically, if it walks on two legs and eats meat, it's a theropod. Typically the larger ones and the earlier ones don't really have feathers, especially not derived advanced feathers like modern birds. But as they evolved through the Jurassic and through the Cretaceous, they got more and more advanced feathers. That's why you'll see depictions of like Velociraptor with feathers, which is some people think is kind of controversial because of Jurassic Park, but it's really not. It's very easy, plain fact that Velociraptors had feathers. So, so when people talk about dinosaurs having feathers, it's mostly theropods. There is some examples of ornithischians, but that's another whole thing. That's basically it. Bipedal, carnivorous dinosaurs, that's where you're going to find your theropods. So that's basically what you should be picturing during this podcast episode. So another part of my podcast here, I usually do this at the end, but if you want to be a part of this podcast, you can go to speakpipe.com/totaldino, and there you can record yourself talking. I always love to hear about your favorite dinosaur, what they like about dinosaurs, and if you go in there and send me a message, I can put your voice right up here on the podcast, and that's what I'm about to do. The reason I'm putting that at the beginning of this episode here is because it leads right into our main topic, which I've already told you is theropods. So this message comes from Jihan, where she tells us a couple of her favorite dinosaurs, which all happen to be theropods.
Hey man, my name is Diane, and I love Uranus. It's so freaking cool. They're like the first dinosaur. Not the first dinosaur. The first bipedal big dinosaur that proved senses that had feathers, which is like awesome, and I love them. Also, you have to make a podcast about microraptors, please. I love them so much. Um, they have those iridescent feathers, the iridescent colors, and I freaking love them. They're so cute. They have 4 wings, and I think it would be really cool if you made a podcast episode about those two, or Carcharodontosaurus. I love them too, because their name is just basically called shark-tooth lizard, and I love sharks. So when my friend said, "Oh yeah, Carcharodontosaurus," I'm like, "Oh yeah, okay, I love that." So yeah, you should totally make an episode for Utranus, Microraptor, and Carcharodontosaurus, because I would totally love it.
Thank you, Jihan. You have great taste in dinosaurs, and it sounds like your friend does too. And I love that all three of those examples are theropods. So that was the Microraptor, Eutyrannus, and Carcharodontosaurus. So briefly, Microraptor is a small dromaeosaur that is covered in feathers. We know this because we have fossil evidence of it. And we also have fossil evidence of its coloration. As Jihan mentioned, it's got iridescent black feathers. We know this by the tiny microscopic melanosomes. I might do a whole episode on that, but long story short, it's microscopic and it tells us the color of the dinosaurs. Eutyrannus also had feathers. It was the largest dinosaur with direct evidence of feathers in the fossil record, which also makes it the biggest animal ever to have feathers. And Carcharodontosaurus is one of the biggest theropods, period. It's right up there with Spinosaurus and Tyrannosaurus. People always argue about the mass versus the length, and probably Giganotosaurus is a little bigger, but Carcharodontosaurus is really close to Giganotosaurus, if you're familiar with that. Just a huge theropod. So thank you for that voice message, and I will mention each of these as we go through the episode. So I'm not trying to just breeze over this. I'm going through quickly because I will mention them again. So yeah, thanks again, Jihan. Now, the way I want to do this is maybe a little weird if you're not used to the idea, but there's this book called The Ancestor's Tale by Richard Dawkins. If you're familiar with it, you probably already know what I'm about to describe. So, as animals evolve, including dinosaurs, an ancestral species will branch off into two and speciate, and then each of those will branch off, and it becomes a branching tree. So the earlier ancestors, there's fewer of them, then there's more and more, and they're related based on how recently they branched off from each other. Picture a phylogeny taxonomy tree. So if you go back in time and look at it backwards, what happens is you can start from any species. In Richard Dawkins' book, he starts with humans, which it makes sense because it would be humans reading the book. But you can start at any plant, animal, beetle, whatever, and as you go back in time, you meet up with the lineage of other species and other groups that you're related to. And the farther back you go, the larger the groups and the earlier speciation happens. So I hope that's not too weird and confusing. It'll make sense as I get going here. So as I mentioned earlier, birds are theropods, so it sounded like a natural place to start here, because we have modern birds, and they will, it'll do a good job leading us back into the theropod family tree. Again, I really hope you can hear the theropods chirping here. Got my window open, I got the birds going. So, here we sit today among modern birds. These are dinosaurs. They're not just descended from dinosaurs, they are dinosaurs because they are descendants of their own ancestors. And that's how the definition works, and that's what it is. So these small theropods, I'm not really going to go into the phylogeny of birds because there's a lot of them, but they have hollow bones, they have feathers, a lot of them fly, a lot of them don't. Sparrows and owls and flamingos and penguins are all birds, and they're all dinosaurs. They do not have teeth, which it seems pretty obvious, but amongst the other dinosaurs, that is a notable difference. So I'm not going to get into every little family of birds, but as you go back from the modern era to the end of the Cretaceous, we're going back in time, remember. Basically, the asteroid that killed all the other dinosaurs killed the other dinosaurs, and it killed almost everything else on Earth. A lot of what survived is small. Basically, the non-avian dinosaurs died because they were too big to be supported by their ecosystem, which was demolished. And I said non-avian dinosaurs. That just means dinosaurs that aren't birds. That's kind of the opposite of how phylogeny works. So that makes it a paraphyletic clade. So all the dinosaurs besides birds are the non-avian dinosaurs. So we are now at the end of Cretaceous event where birds, they're not having a good time either. Their ecosystem is destroyed too. But since they're small, a lot of them could hide kind of underground and under foliage. And their diet was variable. A lot of them were they could eat more than one thing, not just, they weren't just carnivores, they weren't highly specialized. And they could eat seeds and bugs. And two other things that survived pretty well, that are kind of built for survival, are seeds and bugs. Seeds can just sit there for thousands of years without getting water or growing into plants, so that worked out pretty well for the birds. And there's a million different kinds of bugs, and they have shells and wings, and they're small, so seeds and bugs are a good diet at the end of an extinction event. Before the end of the Cretaceous, birds a lot did have teeth, and they still had their little claws on their fingers, which is a very dinosaur-looking trait. These are still technically birds by most definitions, and they were flying around during the Cretaceous, so it's not like birds are only a modern thing. They already existed back then. Moving backwards, we're going up the family tree, so the closest related thing to birds, again, it's very, very granular and very, there's a million different little families, but the next kind of big or well-known family is the Archaeopterygidae. So what these are, I'm sure you've heard of Archaeopteryx. It's basically kind of quote-unquote missing link between dinosaurs and birds. This is what kind of told scientists back in the day that birds basically evolved from dinosaurs. It looks like a small dinosaur, kind of like not a lizard, but it had the long erect legs, and it had a long tail and claws. But if you could look at it, not just the skeleton or the fossils, but if you could look at it in life, it looks basically like a bird. And what's interesting about this is that it had feathers preserved in the fossil, so you can see that it basically looks like a bird. I would say it's kind of more dinosaur-like in like that it has a long tail and that it has teeth. But just the fact that Archaeopteryx has feathers and could probably really could glide more than fly, it really is kind of like a missing link, as much as I hate that phrase. So there's a whole group called Archaeopterigidae that contains Archaeopteryx. Anchiornis is usually grouped in there, if you've heard of that. It's another small bird-like one. Fujian venator is a pretty recent discovery. It looked like a roadrunner. So it's a whole kind of group of dinosaurs, really close to birds. Not quite birds by most definitions, but as we're going up the family tree, that's the closest thing to birds that, for the most part, isn't technically a bird. And so as we combine the groups that we're meeting with, we can now classify ourselves within the larger group. So, for example, when you combine the birds with the group Archaeopterigidae, by some definitions, that is how you define Aviale. This is kind of a bad example because the evolution of birds is a little controversial. Sometimes Aviale excludes Archaeopterigidae, but and sometimes Aviale includes the dromaeosaurs. So it's a little bit of a bad example to mention the topic, but it'll make more sense as I move back. So, moving on back in time, and again, back in time means where these groups combine. So, birds that existed in the Cretaceous and other dromaeosaurs that existed in the Cretaceous might have a common ancestor in the Jurassic. So, as we're going back in time, what we're really talking about is where they meet, because every other group goes on and evolves forward in time separately. So since we're going back from birds, it kind of goes like that. I really hope this isn't too confusing. I thought it was a cool idea. So to kind of clarify that a little bit, in the Cretaceous, there was a group called the Troodontids. These were pretty close to birds, as you can tell by the theme of this episode. They basically looked like dromaeosaurs. So in the Cretaceous, there were also a group called dromaeosaurs. You've probably heard of these. They were basically what you'd call the raptors. That's not a very technical term, but I don't need to get into that right now. But Velociraptor, Utahraptor, things like that, Deinonychus, these are all dromaeosaurs. This is also the group that includes Microraptor, which Jihan mentioned in her voice clip. So, as the name implies, it's a raptor, it's a dromaeosaur. It was covered in feathers and could probably glide or fly. Maybe it could fly, but a lot of times it's described as the four-winged dinosaur because it had long feathers on its arms and on its legs. And it's as the name implies, a very small dromaeosaur. But it fits in here. So thanks, Jihan, for the Microraptor suggestion. This is where it is on the family tree. And they lived mostly in the Cretaceous. Troodontids, basically looked like dromaeosaurs. They were bipedal, of course. They were covered in feathers. They had the sickle-shaped toe claw. Troodontids are typically more gracile and smaller, though there are some pretty big examples. If you think of Stenonychosaurus, Troodon itself, the name is kind of controversial, but basically they're kind of smaller dromaeosaurs. There is another group called Unenlagiidae, which is, I like to think of them as a subgroup of dromaeosaurs, but there was a recent paper that actually put them within birds. If that's how they evolved, then so be it, but just by physical description, they basically look like dromaeosaurs, with long, skinny snouts and kind of longer legs. So it's often hypothesized that they ate fish, kind of lived in the water like storks and cranes and picked fish out of the water, and probably could run really fast. And they also had the sickle toe claw. So, troodontids, ununlagiids, and dromaeosaurs all go back within their own big group called Eumaniraptora. So going back in time, the dromaeosaurs, the ununlagiids, maybe the ununlagiids, and the troodontids had a common ancestor, and that's what defines the group Eumaniraptora. Now, this is where it starts to get interesting. Eumaniraptora, that group, and Aviale, the group that contains birds, and maybe Archaeopterygidae, these combine, going back in time, within the group called Paraves. So, hopefully this is starting to make sense. Paraves is a group of animals, and these are all defined by a common ancestor. The group Paraves branched off into Aviale and Eumaniraptora, and each of those grouped off, so that's why going forward in time, there's a lot of different branches. Going back in time, we are going to continue to meet up with more groups like this. So, every bird is in the Paraves, every dromaeosaur is in the Paraves. This is their common ancestry. Going further back in time, the next group we meet up with is the Oviraptorosauria. So, these are the oviraptors, obviously, and their related kin. Citipodi and Anzu, Gigantoraptor, which was just a huge oviraptorosaur. These are bipedal, of course. They had feathers. They had kind of a parrot-like beak. Some of them had teeth, but most of them didn't have teeth. Picture just a parrot beak. A lot of them had a big crest on their head, and they kind of looked like they're always compared with cassowaries. And they had pennaceous feathers, like birds and like dromaeosaurs. So pennaceous feathers are the ones that are like the long, stiff feathers that let birds fly, and they link together. If you've looked closely at a feather, they have little barbs. They are definitely evolved for very specialized uses. Not always flight, of course, because they had to evolve along. They had to exist within a useful niche in order to evolve, but eventually that's how birds fly. Oviraptorosaurians have pennaceous feathers, probably not used for flight because of how large they were, or just because of how small the feathers were, a lot of biomechanics. But Oviraptorosauria and the group that we were following, the Paraves, these two groups together form the Pennaraptora. This is named after the pennaceous feathers. So everything within this group, in theory, has pennaceous feathers, or at least ancestrally. That's kind of the idea. So as the Pennaraptora evolved forward in time, it branched off into the Oviraptorosauria and the dromaeosaurs and birds, Paraves. So Paraves and Oviraptorosauria combine to form Pennaraptora. Going farther back, the next big group to join our big group here is the Therizinosaurida. These are the big, weird, herbivorous theropods that they're known for having the biggest claws, which is very kind of weird. There's a lot of weird things about therizinosaurs. Therizinosaurus is the most well-known one. They're very big. Probably, I think they're some of the biggest theropods, not quite like T-Rex, but maybe the tallest because they kind of stand upright. They kind of lived, the theory is that they kind of lived like ground sloths, where they kind of lumbered around on their 2 feet, and they were herbivorous, so they used their big weird claws to eat plants. I could do a whole episode on those, but if you're a dinosaur person, you probably are familiar enough with that. So the therizinosaurs are outside of the Pennaraptora, but they are what's called sister groups. The therizinosaurs are sisters to the Panaraptora within their parent group. And then moving up a little bit more outside of that is the Alvarezsauroidea. So these are small bird-like theropods. They are not as close to birds. They're more distantly related to birds than therizinosaurs, but they do look and live like birds. They were very small, had long, skinny legs. The weirdest thing about them is their tiny forelimbs. Their little short arms were very, very short, but they usually had one big claw sticking out of them, which kind of gives them a weird appearance, but they basically look like little roadrunners, but instead of wings, they had a single claw sticking out of their chest, if you can picture that. So, Alvarezsaurs and therizinosaurs, along with the Panaraptora, are all in a big group called Maniraptora. Now, this group is named for mani, meaning hand. They kind of have hands. Really, the specific thing is they have a special bone in their wrist that helps it kind of fold down in a certain way, which helps birds fold their wings up and stuff like that. So within Maniraptora, you'll find everything that I've talked about before. Maniraptorans evolved separate lineages, including Alvarezsaurs, therizinosaurs, dromaeosaurs, troodontids, and birds, and oviraptorosaurs. So everything that we talked about before is included within this group. Going farther back, the Maniraptora is next closely related to the Ornithomimosauria. These are the tall, kind of ostrich-like ones with the long legs and the long necks. Ornithomimus, you've probably heard of Ornithomimus, Gallimimus. They all have names that are like a bird mimic. Gallimimus means chicken mimic. Ornithomimus means bird mimic. There's Pelicanomimus, which means pelican mimic. Anseromimus means duck mimic. So it's kind of just a fun little theme. All their names are bird mimic. Sort of ironically, they are not super close to birds. I mean, they're theropods, and we're getting, they are as far from birds as we have gotten so far in this discussion. So they're not Maniraptorans, they're not Panaraptorans, but they are sisters to the Maniraptorans. So Ornithomimosauria also contains, or specifically includes the Dinochiridae, which includes Dinochirus. This is a pretty weird one. It's kind of like Therizinosaurus, just in how weird it is. It is, again, herbivorous. This is one of the herbivorous theropods. It's got big, long, weird claws. It kind of has a big duck bill, like a hadrosaur. People compare it to Therizinosaurus a lot, mostly just because it's weird. Obviously, it's a completely different group, but they don't stand upright like Therizinosaurs do. But they, they're weird herbivorous theropods. Also, as I mentioned, the Panaraptorans all have pennaceous feathers, so these don't have that. But as we're going forward or going back in time, all these theropods, or a lot of them, still have feathers. They're just not the long, stiff kind. So picture like fluffy or like ostrich feathers, kind of, or like just quills or what's called proto-feathers. Basically, they kind of get simpler and simpler going back in time as they haven't evolved yet. So when you picture Dinochirus, it's kind of like a big shaggy guy, which also we don't know for sure. Ornithomimus has a lot of good feather impressions in the fossil record. So you can, and I don't know the specifics, but there is feather evidence in the fossil record, and we can kind of tell that this group generally probably had feathers, but they are not pennaceous feathers. So that is the Ornithomimosauria. And then going further back in time, we've got okay, so here's an interesting one. Compsognathidae comes in next, which is the small bipedal. Well, they're all bipedal. They're small. They had kind of long legs, long necks. So one weird theory about Compsognathidae is that they might be juveniles of tyrannosaurs, which I don't know how well that holds up. It's sort of hotly debated. It's kind of a hot topic right now. But if they are their own group, then they join the rest of the theropods with the birds and everything here. It's appropriate that they come in here because now, moving back in time, this is where we get to the group that it joins the Tyrannosauroidea. These are the tyrannosaurs. Obviously, this includes Tyrannosaurus rex, and all the other guys in the the Tyrannosaur gang. You got Lithrinax, Daspletosaurus, Albertosaurus, Tarbosaurus. If you know your Tyrannosaurs, they're all this group. Obviously, they're closely related. And again, just another reminder, these all lived in the Cretaceous, like mostly in the late Cretaceous. So they split off from the birds and everything else we're talking about way back in probably the Jurassic, but they lived in the Cretaceous. Obviously, there's gaps in the fossil record, so we don't know exactly how they evolved, but they started out smaller and kind of just got big, and we got T-Rex by the end of the Cretaceous. Earlier forms include, if you go outside of the Tyrannosaurids, but you're still in the Tyrannosauroids, you get Proceratosauridae. So if we were gonna Ancestor's Tale this, if you start from the T-Rex, you go back and then it would join the Tarbosaurus and all the other Tyrannosaurids, and then your little group would join with the Proceratosauridae. Now this is where the Tyrannosaurs that are not as big as the late Cretaceous ones. This is kind of late Cretaceous or late Jurassic, kind of going into the Cretaceous. So some of these are Jurassic, some are early Cretaceous. They look like Tyrannosaurids. Basically they are the Tyrannosauroids, but they're more skinny, they're more gracile, they're smaller overall. There's still some pretty big ones. And one pretty notable thing about them is that they had feathers. Again, not pennaceous feathers because we're outside of the group that evolved those, but they had, we have fossil evidence that they had more primitive kind of shaggy feathers. Specifically on the Eutyrannus, which was another suggestion from Jihan, so thank you again for your voice shout out there. Eutyrannus has direct fossil evidence of feathers, and it's a pretty big dinosaur. It's not as big as T-Rex, but it's it's big, maybe as big as Allosaurus. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I haven't memorized how big it is, but it's a big theropod. And since it has feathers, it is the largest animal ever to have feathers. Not just the largest bird. Well, it's not a bird. But it has feathers, and it's larger than an ostrich. So, biggest animal ever that had feathers. Actually, this is a good time to bring up another little kind of pet peeve of mine. Sometimes you hear people say, like, chickens are descendants of T-Rex, or the most closely related animal to a chicken is a T-Rex. That is all poppycock, because if you're following kind of what I'm describing here, they have a common ancestor, which is all the way back here that we're talking about, but all birds have a common ancestor. All birds are more closely related to any of the other dinosaurs outside of here. And T-Rex is only this closely related to them. So more closely than T-Rex is the Oviraptorosaurs and the Dromaeosaurs. So there's no special link between T-Rex and chicken. That's just kind of a weird an internet joke, or just something people joke about when they don't really understand. Anyway, so going back from the T-Rex, you got Tyrannosaurids, and that joins up with the Proceratosauridae, and that gives you Tyrannosauroidea. And this is where it gets kind of fun, because now you're at the Tyrannosaurs meeting up with the Maniraptorans and all the other ones I mentioned already, and that huge group is called Coelurosauria. So these are Coelurosaurs. So if you can picture this big family tree that I'm describing, starting with birds, you go back and it joins the troodons and the dromaeosaurs, and then that big group goes back and joins the oviraptorosaurs, ornithomimesaurs, therizinosaurs, alvarezsaurs, and now we are at the tyrannosauroids, and the big group that contains all these groups is called Coelurosauria. Some species, way back in the Jurassic, started to speciate and diversify and branched off to all these in that way. Now there's another big group that branched off and did its own thing within the Theropods. So, we're going to leave Coelurosauria there for now, and I'm going to talk about the Carnosauria. Carnosauria is another group of theropods. So I'm going to continue with the Ancestor's Tale style here and start with a recent Carnosaurian, and by recent I mean Cretaceous. I'm going to go ahead and start with Spinosaurus because it's a popular one and because we already talked about it earlier. Spinosaurus is a big theropod that had a spine on its back, and it interestingly is the closest thing to a non-bipedal theropod, which basically in that there was one study that said it was kind of so front heavy that it might have walked on its arm, like dragged its knuckles on the ground, which would make it effectively quadrupedal. I think that theory has mostly been kind of rejected. It's not really it's not the current idea, but as far as I know, that's the closest thing to a quadrupedal theropod, and it doesn't even seem like it existed. So, going back in time from Spinosaurus, you get other Spinosaurids, like Baryonyx, Suchomimus, that type of thing. They had long snouts that are often thought of as eating fish out of the water, like a crane, standing on the edge of the water and eating fish. That's kind of their gig. They had long, crocodile-looking snouts. So then going back from Spinosauridae, you join the Megalosauridae, which contains Megalosaurus, the famous first ever named dinosaur. So large bipedal theropods. Not a ton to say about those here, but that's the closest group related to the Spinosaurids. The Megalosauridae and the Spinosauridae combine to make the group Megalosauria. Now, going further back in time, that group joins the Allosauroidea. So this is the group that contains Allosaurus and its close relatives. And also, if you kind of go along the Allosauria, I guess we're going forward in time here. I know this is a little confusing. Going within the Allosauria group, you've got the Carcharodontosauria. This contains Carcharodontosaurus, as the name implies, and Giganotosaurus, Conchovenator, Meraxes, if you've heard of that one, the recently named Tamaryraptor. These are all huge theropods. These are the ones that could contend with T-Rex in size, at least the larger ones. And again, this is the third shout out from our friend Jihan with her voice clip. So, Carcharodontosaurus, thank you for suggesting that. It is a very handsome theropod, and it is right here in this group, Carcharodontosauria. Carcharodontosaurs were pretty big, literally, in the early Cretaceous. They kind of piddled out by the late Cretaceous, mostly, it seems like, because they were taken over by the Tyrannosaurs. They kind of moved south. It's thought that maybe they ate sauropods. That's another whole thing we can talk about later, but that's where they are on the family tree. So, Carcharodontosaurs are basically sisters to the Allosauridae, the Allosaurs, and that group is called the Allosauria. So, going back, that combines with the Megalosauria, and that's the Spinosaurs and the Megalosaurs. That combines to all that is within the group Carnosauria. So after this split off from the rest of the theropods, those were going on through the Jurassic and Cretaceous, evolving those separate lineages. So that whole little chunk there is the Carnosauria. Now, if you go back from Carnosauria, and if you remember earlier we were talking about Coelurosauria, this is where they join. So Coelurosauria, the T-Rex, on down to the birds, that split off and was going that way. Carnosauria split off and was going that way. Before they diversified, they were a single group of animals, which really would be a single species back then. And this group, the combined coelurosaurs and carnosaurs, is called the Tetanurae. Everything that we talked about before is now within this group. So we're going to put a pin in Tetanurae. And there's another whole big group, which is not as big, but another big chunk, called the Ceratosauria. This is what includes the Abelisaurs, Ceratosaurs, as the name implies, and the Noasaurs, which are a pretty weird group. So if we want to go backwards in this one, it probably makes sense to start with the Abelisaurs, like the Carnotaurus, Majungasaurus. These are the pretty large theropods. They're known for having short snouts, like a pug face almost, and really, really short arms. If you want to make fun of T-Rex for having short arms, you should really be making fun of Abelisaurs. They're the ones with the tiny, tiny arms. And some of them have like horns on their head, which is pretty weird for a meat-eating dinosaur, but yeah, they're pretty crazy. And then going back in time from the Abelisaurs, they are closely related to Noasaurs, which are kind of an overlooked group a lot of the time. They're much smaller. They had long legs and kind of long, skinny necks. They kind of had the weird arms, not as much as the Abelisaurs, but you can kind of see how they're related. So they're close. The Noasaurs are close to Abelisaurs, and then if you go back from them, those are related to the Ceratosaurs, which are they're often compared to Allosaurus just because they lived in the late Jurassic. So Ceratosaurus, big carnivorous theropod. It also has kind of horns on its face. That's what you can kind of recognize it by. So Ceratosaurus and the Ceratosauridae are related to Abelisaurs there. And that whole group is the Ceratosauria. So, going back from Ceratosauria, that meets up with the Tetanurae, which includes everything else we've discussed. And that group is called the Averostra. So that is pretty much all the big main theropod groups. Going back, there's still more, but they're not super closely classified, at least a lot of them. We're kind of going earlier through the Jurassic and into the Triassic at this point. So the more basal you get, the more earlier in time, basically, well, it's harder to find fossils, so it seems like there's fewer of them. But also, the diversification just hasn't really happened yet. So there actually were fewer, species. But this is where you'll find like Dilophosaurus, and there used to be a group called Dilophosauridae, but that is not a thing anymore. The way it was classified has been found to not really be correct. So there's Cryolophosaurus is in here. They're basically kind of getting smaller and smaller. They're still pretty big for their ecosystems, but they're smaller than T-Rex and Spinosaurus, obviously. And then there is one group, the Coelophysoideae and the Coelophysidae, which contains Coelophysis. We're in the Triassic now, obviously, which again are small. They're gracile theropods with long, skinny legs, long necks. You could probably picture them running around, darting about. Only a couple meters long at this point, because by now we're approaching the ancestral theropod. So there's a few more small, gracile, bipedal, long neck guys, and then that is pretty much it. You're at the beginning of the theropods. The next group that you'd run into as being closely related to where we've arrived at is the sauropods. So we're at the point where if you're outside this group, you're not a theropod anymore. So that's it. So if you can picture it moving forward, there was one small bipedal carnivore that diversified into Coelophysis, and then this other group, and the Ceratosaurs branched off, and then the Carnosaurs turned into Allosaurs and Spinosaurs, and then Coelurosaurs evolved and branched off into Tyrannosaurs, and then, you got the Ornithomimasaurs and Oviraptors, Dromaeosaurs, and finally birds, and that brings us to today. So, just to go a little bit further, sauropods are the sister group of theropods, or really sauropodomorphs. Sauropodomorphs when they were bipedal before they evolved into sauropods. That's obviously the Saurischians, and then if you go a little bit farther back, that's the Ornithischians, which is the other herbivorous group. And then the next group name, the next clade up, is the Dinosauria, and that's it. So that's as far back as you can go and still be a dinosaur. So that's it. That's theropods. Hopefully this backwards Ancestor's Tale version wasn't too confusing. I hope it would have been a lot easier if you had a visual to follow along with. So I know it's kind of weird just listening to this as a podcast form. I hope you could follow it, and even if it was confusing, I hope there was some good information in there that you enjoyed. I hope you can hear the theropods chirping behind me, because I thought that was a really nice touch. Happy spring, everybody. It is now spring. The theropods are chirping. And yeah, thank you for listening. This has been the Theropod episode. Feel free to comment on the videos or the podcast, rate, like, subscribe, feed the algorithm. I know I put these out maybe once a month, sometimes once every few months. I'm doing other stuff. Check out my YouTube page, my website. I'm not really slowing down, but if you want to join me on Patreon, there's a lot of cool stuff. You can request dinosaurs. Thanks for listening. Thank you for interacting. Let's have fun with this and keep it going. Oh, and again, go to speakpipe.com/totaldino and just tell me your favorite dinosaur. I'll put you in an episode. I guess that's about it. Thanks again for listening to Total Dino, the podcast that asks, what's your favorite dinosaur?